Functions let you group a series of statements together to perform a specific task. If different parts of a script repeat the same task, you can reuse the function, rather than repeating the same set of statements over and over again. Grouping together the statements that are required to answer a question or perform a task helps organize your code. Furthermore, the statements in a function are not always executed when the page loads, so functions also offer a way to store the steps needed to achieve a specific task. The script can then ask the function to perform all of those steps as and when they are required. For example, you might have a task that you only want to perform if the user clicks on a specific element on the page. Well, if you store that in a function, you can call it when that particular event is triggered. If you're going to ask a function to perform its task later, then you need to give your function a name. That name should describe the task it is performing. When you ask it to perform its task, it's known as calling the function. The steps that the function needs to perform in order to perform its task are packaged up inside of a code block. A code block consists of one or more statements contained inside the curly braces. And remember, you don't write a semicolon after the closing curly brace like you do after a normal statement. Some functions need to be provided with information in order to achieve a given task. For example, a function to calculate the area of a box would need to know the width and the height. Pieces of information that are passed to a function are known as parameters. When you write a function, you expect it to provide you with an answer. The response is known as a return value. So to create a function, you give it a name and you write statements that are needed to achieve the task that are within the curly brace. This is known as a function declaration. This is a simple example of a function declaration. You declare a function using the function keyword. You give the function a name. This is also referred to as an identifier, and it's always followed by parentheses. The statements that perform the task sit inside of a code block. These are inside of the curly braces. This function is very basic. It only contains one statement, but it illustrates how to write a function. Most functions that you will see or write are likely to consist of more statements. The point to remember is that functions store the code required to perform a specific task, and that a script can ask a function to perform that task whenever it's needed. If different parts of a script need to perform the same task, you do not need to repeat the same statements multiple times. You use a function to do it and reuse the same code. Once you've declared the function, you can then execute all of the statements between the curly braces with just one line of code. This is known as calling the function. To run the code in a function, you use the function name followed by parentheses. In programming speak, you would say that this code calls a function. You can call the same function as many times as you want within the same JavaScript file. This is an example of a function name. The function can store the instructions for a specific task. When you need the script to perform the task, you call the function. The function executes the code in the code block, and when it is finished, the code continues to run from the point where it was initially called. Sometimes you will see a function called before it has been declared. This still works because the interpreter runs through the script before executing each statement, so it will know that a function declaration appears later in the script. But for the moment, we'll declare the function before we call it. Let's look at an example of how we can declare and call a function. Here I have a very basic page. All that the page contains is an h1 and a div. We're going to go ahead and we're going to be creating a function in JavaScript that's going to update a message that's on the page. I'll explain the syntax as we create it. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to assign an ID name to my div. I'm going to give the div an ID of message. Having the ID assigned to the div will allow me to hook this div once I start creating my script. In this particular example, I'm going to create the script underneath the content that's on the page. And the reason why is because for this particular example, the HTML elements need to be in existence prior to the JavaScript running. So we'll go ahead and we'll create the script tag, and we'll ensure that the opening and closing script tag are going to be underneath the content that's on the page, but they'll appear within the body tag. So they're going to be inserted right before the closing body tag like this. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. The variable we'll be using in this example is going to be called MSG for message. I'll go ahead and put the value for the variable inside a pair of single quotes, and then I'm going to terminate my statement with a semicolon. We learned how to do this before in our exercise about variables. Now that I have the variable, I'm going to go ahead and create a function. The first thing we need to do is we need to give our function a name. We're going to give our function a name of update message. Once we've specified the name of the function, so this is an example of a named function, we're going to go ahead and insert our opening and closing parentheses, and we'll leave those blank for now, and then we're going to insert the opening and closing curly braces. Inside of the curly braces, we'll go ahead and we'll specify our code block. So as we just learned, this is the function keyword, this is the function name, and now we'll go ahead and create the code block. What we want to have happen here is the user is going to be shown a message on the page. The message is going to be stored inside of the HTML element whose ID attributes have the value of message. The message is going to be changed using JavaScript. So we have our variable called MSG, and this is going to hold the new message that we want to insert onto our page. Once the variable has been created, we're going to go ahead and we're going to run a function called updateMessage. Our code block is going to create two statements. The first one is going to be another variable called EL. That'll be an abbreviation for element, and we're going to use document.getElementById, and then in the parentheses for getElement.id, I'm going to pass on the ID message, which is the location of where I want to insert my new message. I'm going to terminate the statement with a semicolon, and then I'm going to go ahead and call that EL, that's our new variable that we just created, .textContent is going to be equal to MSG. These statements update the message at the top of the page. The function acts like a store. It holds the statements that are contained within the curly braces until we're ready to use them. Those statements are not going to be run until the function is called. The function is only going to be called once we implicitly create the function call. So within our code block, we're creating another variable that we're calling L. We're making that equal to the method of document.getElementById. What document.getElementById does is it returns an element. If there's an element with the value of the ID attribute that matches, in this case that's message, which is going to match this ID name up here inside of our code, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the method of text content and make that equal to whatever the value is of the message variable that we created earlier. Our function has now been created, but it's not going to actually run until we call the function. So now that we have the message here, we need to go ahead and we need to call the function. Calling the function is done very simply. We're simply going to state the name of our function followed by opening and closing parentheses and a semicolon. If we save the page and we go view it in the browser, you're going to see when I click refresh on my page, this message is going to change. Now it says sign up to receive our newsletter for 10% off. It's now displaying our message that we had created. In order to make our code a little bit more dynamic, we're going to use a method that will allow the function to not be called for a specified amount of time. In order to do this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the set timeout method. I'm going to comment out my call for my function, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to write set timeout, and then in the parentheses I'm going to specify the name of my function followed by a comma, and then I'm going to place the number of milliseconds that I want the pause to run for. So for this example we'll use 3000, which is going to equal 3 seconds. This is going to put a delay on the call of our function. setTimeout is a method that calls a function or evaluates an expression after a specified number of milliseconds. The function is only going to be executed once using this particular method. I'm going to save my page, and if we refresh in the browser, you'll see that the initial message is displayed, and after 3 seconds it automatically switches to the new message. So in this example, we've actually created a very basic function, and then we're using a function call to run the function, and here we're actually using the setTimeout method so that we can delay the function from being called for a specified amount of seconds.